Stephen had dreamed of this day for years. At 68, living in a quiet fishing town in Alaska, he was finally graduating with his degree in environmental science, a goal he had chased through long winters, endless reading by the wood stove, and assignments written in the dim glow of a kerosene lamp when storms knocked out the power. His husband, Mark, and their two grown children had promised to be there, front row, cheering him on. He had even booked a table at his favorite Anchorage seafood restaurant for after the ceremony, imagining them laughing over halibut and chowder, sharing in his triumph. But the first crack in that vision had come a week earlier, when his older brother Alan called with news of a once-in-a-lifetime 40th wedding anniversary party, set for the exact same day as Stephen's graduation. "Everyone's coming," Alan had said, his voice warm but careless. Stephen had reminded him of the date months ago, but Alan brushed it off. "It's just a ceremony, Steve. We can toast you at the party later." That morning, Stephen pressed his gown and adjusted his cap in the mirror, determined to push aside the sting of those words. Maybe they'd still make it, he told himself. Maybe Mark and the kids would come to the ceremony and then head to the party afterward. Arriving at the university, he spotted 6 seats with reserved bay tags in the audience. Empty. His eyes scanned every row, each door, but no familiar faces appeared. The dean's speech blurred in his ears as the ache in his chest grew heavier. When they called his name, he walked across the stage with a steady stride, shook the dean's hand, and accepted the diploma he had worked half a lifetime for. Polite applause rose from the crowd, but without the cheers he had imagined, it felt strangely hollow. Stepping off the stage, he reached for his phone, half hoping for a congratulatory message, maybe an apology for being late. Instead, the screen lit up with a text from Mark. "We need to talk." Urgently. The words hit harder than the empty seats had. His pulse quickened, and for a moment he stood frozen in the hallway outside the auditorium, graduates brushing past him with flowers, balloons, and family in tow. The Alaskan spring air seeped in from the open doors, carrying the scent of thawing earth, but Stephen felt only the cold weight of uncertainty. What could be so urgent that it couldn't wait until after the ceremony? He read the message again, his mind spinning with possibilities. None of them good. Outside, his classmates posed for pictures in the pale sunlight, their laughter drifting over the hum of conversation. Stephen stayed apart from the celebration, diploma case tucked under his arm, staring down at the phone in his hand and wondering if the day that was supposed to mark one of his proudest achievements had just turned into the beginning of something else entirely. Stephen stayed on the edge of the bustling crowd for several minutes, the diploma case feeling heavier in his grip than the stack of research papers he'd carried through his years of study. All around him, families clustered together. Mothers hugging daughters in bright caps, fathers hoisting toddlers onto their shoulders to wave at newly graduated sons. The murmur of happy chatter was pierced occasionally by bursts of applause for a favorite professor or the snap of a camera shutter. But for Stephen, there was only the steady drum of his own heartbeat and the silent glow of his phone screen. He typed back to Mark, "What's going on? Where are you?" The reply came in seconds. "We're at Alan's. Can you come over? It's important." The words were short, casual almost, but the meaning was like ice water in Stephen's veins. They were all at the anniversary party. Not just Mark, but the kids too, Emily and Daniel, choosing cake and music over watching their father walk across the stage after years of sacrifice. A sharp wind blew through the open auditorium doors, making him shiver, even though the spring sun was bright. He slipped out into the crisp Alaskan air, where the parking lot was crowded with cars leaving in slow lines. As he walked toward his truck, he glanced back once more at the university building, its brick facade glowing in the sunlight, and felt the finality of it. His moment had come and gone, unseen by the people who mattered most. The drive home was quiet, except for the steady hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional cry of a distant raven cutting through the air. He passed frozen ponds beginning to crack open, releasing the faint smell of wet earth. Normally, he loved this transition from winter to spring, but now the beauty outside seemed muted, like he was looking at it through a pane of frosted glass. About halfway home, his phone rang. Emily's voice burst through the truck's speakers, high with excitement. "Dad, Alan's party is amazing. There's a huge spread, live music, and we even got you a slice of the cake to bring back. Stephen's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Emily, he said, keeping his voice even, I just graduated today. You weren't there. The silence on the other end stretched too long before she finally replied, We figured you'd understand. A ceremony is just a formality, right? The degree's the real thing. Her words were light, but they cut deeper than she realized. A formality. As if the years of long nights, the mist gatherings, the cold mornings spent poring over textbooks by the fire were nothing but items on a checklist. I see, Stephen murmured, not trusting himself to say more. By the time he reached his driveway, the low sun was throwing long shadows across the snow-mottled yard. He sat in the truck for a while, engine idling, watching a single crow hop along the fence line. The house looked exactly as it had that morning, still, expectant, but the emptiness inside pressed against the windows like an invisible weight. He stepped inside to find the quiet almost unnerving. No voices, no music, no clatter from the kitchen. On the counter, there was only a note in Mark's familiar handwriting, Went to help Alan with party setup. Come by when you can. Stephen stared at it, feeling the hollowness spread. This was the urgent matter Mark had mentioned, stringing up decorations or arranging chairs for his brother's guests. He walked slowly to the living room, hung his gown neatly over the arm of the couch, and set the diploma case on the mantel. The gold lettering of his name gleamed faintly in the dim light. For a long moment, he stood there, thinking of the nights he had nearly given up, when the coursework felt too heavy, when the storms rattled the windows and the fire died in the stove, and he'd wrapped himself in a blanket to keep reading anyway. Those nights had been his test, and he'd passed. He had done it for himself, as much as for anyone else, but the ache of knowing his family hadn't cared enough to witness it was like a cold knot in his chest. His phone buzzed again. A photo had come through from his son, Daniel. It was a group shot from the party. Mark standing with his arm around Alan, both grinning at the camera. Emily in the background holding a glass of champagne, Daniel with a beer in hand. The massive anniversary cake took up most of the table in front of them, its frosting glistening under the lights. Someone had tagged it with the caption, Family First. Stephen let out a short, humorless laugh. Family first, indeed. Not once had anyone called to ask how the ceremony had gone, or even to say they were sorry for missing it. He set the phone face down on the counter and poured himself a mug of coffee, the bitter steam curling upward. He sat in his armchair by the window, sipping slowly, the heat of the cup grounding him. Outside, the sky was beginning to blush with the first signs of sunset, streaks of orange and pink reflecting off the ice-crusted water beyond the pines. Normally, he would have texted Mark, telling him to save him a dance or a piece of dessert, maybe even driven over to join late. But tonight, he stayed still. The day had been his, and they had chosen not to be part of it. He wouldn't go chasing them to the party. Yet, no matter how hard he tried to let the thought go, one question kept circling back in his mind. If the party was all this was about, why had Mark said, urgent? What exactly was waiting for him if he did go over there? The uncertainty prickled at the edge of his thoughts, turning the quiet of the house into something more like a pause before a storm. Stephen sat in his armchair for nearly an hour, letting the coffee cool in his hands as the minutes ticked by. The room was warm from the humming baseboard heaters, but the warmth felt superficial, like it hadn't touched him at all. Every so often, his gaze drifted to the diploma on the mantel, and he imagined for a moment what it would have been like to have Mark and the kids see him walk across that stage, hear the applause, feel that shared pride. But the truth was, they had made their choice, and he wasn't sure an apology or a saved slice of cake could undo the sting. His phone sat on the side table, face down, silent. Still, that one word, urgent, kept gnawing at him. He replayed the earlier message from Mark in his mind, searching for a tone, a hidden meaning. Maybe there was more to it than helping Alan with the party. Maybe someone had said something, or there was some family matter brewing that they didn't want to talk about over the phone. In the quiet of the cabin, the absence of answers felt louder than any conversation could. Finally, he picked up the phone and sent a short message. "What's urgent? I'm home. Call me." He set it back down and waited. The response came as a ring less than a minute later. Mark's voice was strained, clipped. "Stephen, you need to come to the hospital. Daniel had an accident at Alan's place." Stephen's heart dropped. What happened? He was on the back deck hanging lights, trying to impress Emily's kids, and he slipped, landed bad. The doctors think his wrist might be broken. Relief that it wasn't something worse mingled with a rush of worry. "Which hospital?" "Anchorage Memorial. I'll meet you here." Stephen didn't even bother changing out of his gown pants, just threw on a heavy coat, grabbed his truck keys, and headed out into the crisp evening. The drive into Anchorage was a blur of headlights and fading daylight. His mind was locked on Daniel, remembering when he was a boy running around their yard in winter boots 2 sizes too big, the way he'd cling to Stephen's hand crossing icy patches. The idea of him in a hospital bed now brought a sharp ache that pushed the earlier hurt into the background, at least for the moment. Memorial Hospital was busy for a Saturday night. The smell of disinfectant hit him as he stepped inside, sharp and sterile, mixing with the faint aroma of burnt coffee from the vending machine area. At the reception desk, he gave Daniel's name, and the nurse directed him to Bay 7. He walked briskly through the sliding glass doors into the treatment area, passing curtained bays where muffled conversations and the beeping of monitors filled the air. Pulling back the curtain at Bay 7, he froze. Daniel was lying on the bed, his right arm encased in a temporary splint, looking pale but alert. Mark stood beside him, holding his good hand. Emily leaned against the wall, scrolling on her phone. And there, at the foot of the bed, chatting easily with the attending doctor, was Alan. The sight of all of them together, here, in the hospital, when not a single one of them had been at the ceremony hours before, sent a wave of bitterness through Stephen so strong he almost turned around. But Daniel's eyes lit up when he saw him. "Dad, you came." Stephen stepped forward immediately, pulling a chair to the bedside. "Of course I came. How's the pain?" "Hurts, but they gave me something," Daniel said, glancing toward the nurse. "They said it's just a fracture, nothing permanent." The doctor, a tall man with tired eyes, confirmed it. "Clean break of the radius, 6 weeks in a cast, and he'll be fine. He's lucky. It could have been worse with that fall." Alan chuckled as though the whole thing were a minor inconvenience. "Told him not to try hanging those lights without me. He's still stubborn, just like his old man." Stephen ignored the jab, focusing on Daniel. He brushed a hand over his son's hair like he had when Daniel was small. "You were brave. I'm proud of you." Emily put her phone away at last. "We were going to call you again if you didn't show. He kept asking for you." The words might have been meant to comfort, but they felt hollow, considering how easy it had been for them to skip his graduation earlier. He nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm glad you did call. Let's just get him home so he can rest." Mark stepped toward him. "Why don't we all go back to Alan's after?" "Everyone's still there. We can." "No," Stephen said sharply, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. "Daniel's coming home with me." Daniel looked relieved at that, and Stephen realized his son probably didn't want to be the center of attention at a party with his arm in a sling. As the nurse arrived with casting materials, Stephen volunteered to go with Daniel to the small room where they'd mold and set the cast. Away from the others, the air felt lighter. Daniel was quieter now, but after a few minutes, he spoke. "I'm sorry I missed your graduation, Dad. I really wanted to go, but everyone said the party would be more fun." Stephen took a breath, steadying his voice. "It's not your fault. You're an adult, but sometimes adults make decisions that aren't about fun. They're about showing up for people who matter." Daniel nodded slowly, looking down at his lap. "I get it now. I should have been there." When they returned to Bay 7, the group was thinner. Alan had left for the party, taking Emily with him to keep the music going. Only Mark remained, looking awkward in the corner. "Doctor says you can take him home whenever you're ready," Mark said. Stephen signed the discharge papers without a word. As they walked out to the parking lot, the night air was even colder, stars just beginning to prick through the deepening blue. The hospital's bright lights fell away as they reached the truck, the crunch of gravel underfoot loud in the silence. Once Daniel was settled in the passenger seat, Mark lingered by the driver's door. "Stephen, can we talk later? About today?" Stephen didn't look at him. "We can talk, but not tonight. Tonight's about getting Daniel home and comfortable." The drive back was quiet, except for the steady hum of the heater and the occasional rattle from Daniel's sling. When they pulled into the driveway, Stephen helped him inside, settled him on the couch, and wrapped him in a thick wool blanket. He made hot cocoa the way Daniel liked, extra marshmallows, even though Stephen himself thought it was too sweet, and placed it in his good hand. Mark came in a few minutes later, hovering like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Stephen finally met his gaze. "You know, I didn't need a parade today. Just my family sitting in those seats. That's all. But you weren't there." Mark's jaw tightened. "I thought you'd understand. 40 years of marriage is a big milestone for Alan." Stephen's voice was calm, but each word landed with weight. "And so is this. Graduating at my age, after everything, is a big milestone too. You all missed it. I don't know if you realize how much that hurts." Mark opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally nodded. "I hear you." But Stephen wasn't sure yet if that meant anything. For now, he turned back to Daniel, determined to end the night in the only way that mattered, being there when his son needed him, even if no one had done the same for him just hours earlier. The next morning, pale light seeped through the cabin's frosted windows, casting long bars across the wooden floor. Stephen woke early, as he always did, his body trained by decades of early shifts and long winters. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the baseboard heaters and the occasional creak of the timbers in the cold. He moved quietly into the kitchen, brewed a pot of coffee, and stood at the counter, staring out toward the tree line where a light mist curled around the pines. Daniel was still asleep on the couch, his arm propped on pillows, his breathing even. Mark was nowhere in sight, though Stephen suspected he'd gone back to Alan's that morning. His truck was gone from the drive. The image of those 6 empty seats at the graduation replayed in Stephen's mind like an unwanted loop, each repetition adding a heavier weight. He thought of how quickly his family had mobilized to be at Alan's party, how they'd filled a hospital room within minutes when Daniel was hurt, and how those same people couldn't find 2 hours to sit in a hall and watch him cross a stage. The unfairness of it gnawed at him, not just as a passing slight, but as proof of something deeper, proof that his milestones would always be secondary. After breakfast, Stephen called the seafood restaurant in Anchorage where he'd booked the post-graduation table. The reservation had been for 8 people, a table by the big window overlooking the harbor. He'd imagined the smell of the sea mixing with the clink of glasses, imagined Mark squeezing his hand while Emily and Daniel teased him about being the oldest guy in the class. Canceling the reservation the day before had felt like surrender. Now, he told the manager to keep the deposit and thanked him politely. When he hung up, the quiet of the cabin pressed in again. By mid-morning, Daniel stirred awake, blinking at the light. "Morning, Dad," he murmured, wincing as he shifted his arm. Stephen handed him a mug of cocoa, the way he'd done last night. "How's the pain?" Daniel shrugged. "Not bad. I was thinking, maybe I'll help you with the firewood once this heals. You always do it alone." It was a small thing, but it caught Stephen off guard. "I'd like that," he said, and meant it. Around noon, Mark returned. He walked in carrying a plastic container of food and a cautious expression. "Brought some of the leftovers from Alan's," he said, setting it on the counter. The air between them was heavy with all the words unsaid. "Stephen, can we talk now?" Mark asked quietly. Stephen glanced at Daniel, then nodded toward the porch. Outside, the cold air bit at their faces, the sky low and gray. "I want to explain," Mark began, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Alan's anniversary was important to him. He's been talking about it for months, and the kids wanted to be there. I thought, maybe you'd understand, since your graduation was more for you than for anyone else." Stephen's jaw tightened. "More for me? Mark, I've spent years on that degree. Nights, weekends, every spare minute while you were here with them. And the one day I wanted us together, you chose a party." Mark exhaled sharply, looking down. "I made a bad call. I should have been there. I know that now." Stephen studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity. "I don't think you understand what it's like to always be the one showing up, and never the one being shown up for. I was there for your work events, for the kids' milestones, for every family thing that mattered to you. But when it came to mine..." He let the unfinished sentence hang between them. Mark's shoulders sagged. "You're right, and I'm sorry. I don't want this to be what you remember about your graduation." "Then what do you want me to remember?" Stephen asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Mark hesitated. "That you achieved something incredible. That you made all of us proud, even if we were too stupid to be there and say it." Stephen turned his gaze toward the snow-dusted pines. Pride doesn't mean much if it's invisible. For a while, they just stood there in the cold, the conversation drifting into silence. Finally, Mark said, "Tell me what I can do to make it right." Stephen thought about it. "Be here. Not just physically, but here. Stop treating what matters to me as optional. And talk to the kids about it. They need to learn that family isn't just about showing up when it's convenient or fun." Mark nodded, the seriousness in his eyes making Stephen believe, cautiously, that he meant it. When they went back inside, Daniel was watching a nature documentary, the sound of whale song filling the room. Stephen sat with him, grateful for the distraction. They spent the afternoon quietly, Daniel dozing, Stephen reading by the fire, Mark making an effort to help with chores. In the evening, Emily called. Her voice was hesitant. "Dad, I'm sorry about missing your graduation. I didn't think, I just went along with everyone else." Stephen appreciated her honesty. "I hope you'll think differently next time," he said gently. "You can't redo moments like that." She promised she would, and he believed she wanted to mean it. Later, as the fire crackled and the wind rattled the windows, Stephen sat with a notebook, jotting down a few thoughts, not about the hurt, but about the things he still wanted to do. He realized that his graduation, painful as its absence of family support had been, was still his accomplishment. No one could take that from him. It wasn't a closing chapter, but the start of a new one, and he intended to live it on his terms. That night, after Daniel went to bed, Mark brought over a wrapped package. "I was going to give you this after dinner at the restaurant," he said. Inside was a leather-bound field journal, embossed with Stephen's initials. "For your next adventure," Mark said softly. Stephen ran his hand over the smooth cover, conflicted but touched. "Thank you," he said, meeting Mark's gaze. There was still a long road ahead to rebuild the trust and balance that had been lost, but in that moment, he felt the first faint shift toward something better. Still, as he placed the journal on the mantel beside his diploma, he couldn't help but think of those 6 empty seats, silent witnesses to the work, the years, and the moment his family had chosen not to share. That memory, he knew, would never fully leave him. But neither would the knowledge that he had achieved something remarkable, and that, whether they understood it or not, was worth more than any party. A week after his graduation, the snow in the yard had begun to recede, leaving patches of dark earth and stubborn ice under the pine trees. The air was still cold enough for his breath to cloud, but the days were noticeably longer, and the light held a faint promise of spring. Stephen pulled into the driveway after spending the morning in Anchorage, where he had signed the final paperwork for his promotion at the Environmental Research Center. It wasn't just a new title in office, it was validation that the years of study had been worth it, that his skills and persistence were being recognized by people outside his family. He carried the offer letter inside, set it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee pot, and stood for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Daniel was at a friend's place, Emily was back in Juneau for work, and Mark was in the garage, the faint sound of tools clinking drifting through the door. It was a rare pocket of solitude, and Stephen felt its weight and possibility all at once. Over the past week, small changes had begun to take root in the household. Mark had been more present, not just in the physical sense, but in the way he asked questions and listened to the answers. He'd taken over cooking dinner 3 nights in a row, insisting Stephen use the time for himself. Daniel, still adjusting to life with one arm in a cast, had found new ways to contribute. Helping with paperwork, prepping firewood, even keeping the stove stocked without being asked. Emily had sent a framed photograph she'd ordered from the university photographer, capturing Stephen in his cap and gown on the stage. It arrived with a handwritten note. "I'm sorry I wasn't there, but I'm proud of you." Stephen had placed it on the mantel beside his diploma and the leather field journal Mark had given him, creating a small, quiet shrine to a moment he refused to let fade away. That evening, Mark came in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. "Alan called," he said, his tone careful. He wants to have us over for dinner next weekend. Said he wants to make things right. Stephen leaned back in his chair, studying Mark's expression. And what does make things right mean to him? Mark shrugged. I think, acknowledging what happened, he sounded genuine. Stephen considered it for a long moment before nodding. I'll go, but I'm not interested in pretending nothing happened. Mark met his eyes. Fair enough. The following Saturday, they drove to Alan's sprawling home on the edge of town. The house was warm and filled with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread. Alan greeted them at the door, his manner a little stiff, but his eyes carrying something that looked like sincerity. Stephen, he said, I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have scheduled my anniversary party on your graduation day, and I sure as hell shouldn't have dismissed it like it wasn't important. I'm sorry. Stephen nodded once, appreciating the directness. Thank you. I hope you mean that. Alan's jaw tightened, then he gave a small nod. I do. Dinner was awkward at first, but as the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, stories from their childhood, local fishing gossip, the endless unpredictability of Alaskan weather. Yet, under the surface, Stephen remained aware of how fragile this new openness was. Trust wouldn't be rebuilt in a single meal. It would take consistent choices, consistent presence. He knew that from experience. When they returned home, the night was still and clear, the stars sharp in the deep black sky. Stephen stepped out of the truck and paused, looking up. The air was so crisp it felt like it could shatter. Mark came to stand beside him. You've been quiet, he said. Stephen gave a small smile. Just thinking about how far I've come, not just with the degree or the job, but with knowing what I will and won't accept anymore. Mark nodded slowly. I get that, and I don't want to be the guy who makes you feel unseen again. Stephen glanced at him, the sincerity in his voice matching the look in his eyes. Then don't be. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and different. The hurt of that empty graduation still lingered. Stephen doubted it would ever fully disappear, but it no longer defined his every thought. Instead, it had become a marker, a line in the sand that reminded him to value his own achievements, whether or not anyone else did. He hung his diploma in his new office at the research center, where sunlight streamed through the big windows onto the gold lettering of his name. Visitors often asked about it, and he told them proudly, never downplaying the effort it had taken. One afternoon, Daniel came into the office to visit, his cast now covered in colorful signatures. He looked around at the books, the framed certificates, the view of the harbor. You really made it, Dad, he said, a mix of awe and admiration in his voice. Stephen smiled. I'm still making it. That's the thing. Graduation wasn't the end. It was the start of something new. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, and Stephen hoped the lesson would stick, that showing up for people mattered, and that honoring their moments was a choice worth making. Spring eventually loosened winter's grip, and the yard filled with the smell of thawing earth and wet pine needles. Stephen spent more time outside, tending to the garden beds, repairing the dock, and walking along the shore. Mark often joined him, helping without being asked, their conversations easy in the quiet spaces between tasks. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still unspoken echoes of that day. But there was also a renewed willingness to meet each other halfway. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bands of gold and crimson, Stephen stood on the porch with a cup of coffee. The air was cool, the kind that hinted summer was still a promise rather than a reality. From inside, he could hear Daniel laughing at something on the television, the sound warm and unguarded. Mark came to stand beside him, holding 2 envelopes. Got something for you, he said, handing them over. The first was a card from Emily, with a simple line written inside. Proud of you every day. The second was an invitation from the university to speak at next year's commencement ceremony about non-traditional students in lifelong learning. Stephen looked up from the letter, the corners of his mouth lifting. Think I'll have to say yes to this. Mark smiled. And this time, I'll be in the front row. Stephen chuckled, though his voice was steady. You'd better be, all of you. He thought about the long road it had taken to get here, the lonely walk off that stage, the hollow quiet of the cabin that day, the sting of being overlooked. And yet, here he was, with his family slowly learning to show up, with his own sense of worth no longer tethered to their approval. As the light faded and the first stars began to appear, Stephen felt the kind of peace that comes from surviving something you didn't think you could. The empty seats at his graduation would always be part of his story, but they were no longer the defining image. Now, it was the diploma on his mantle, the field journal waiting to be filled, the future opening wide before him. He sipped his coffee, breathed in the clean Alaskan air, and let the quiet settle, not as absence this time, but as possibility.